time. And actually, one of the most common causes of hearing loss is due to aging. And 3/4 of people who are deaf or hard of hearing are over age 60. However, if you are born deaf and learn ASL at a young age or throughout your life, oftentimes you embrace deaf culture. And so people who are deaf and embrace deaf culture oftentimes will spell the word deaf with a capital D. And when they sign, they'll sign in a specific way that they're kind of owning their deafness as opposed to seeing it as just a hearing condition. But it's, as I mentioned, you can be born deaf and really embrace the culture, or you can your hearing can decline. And at about 20 years old is when that starts to happen. So once again, you are really designing for your future self or your parents when you're considering people with disabilities. And some assistive technologies to support people with hearing loss are, of course, closed captioning. There's also sound amplifiers if you have hearing loss, but it's not total hearing loss. But it's important to note that it can be rude to ask someone like, oh, can you hear me? Or, elevate your voice so that they can hear you. So if someone says that, they can't hear, don't assume that just speaking louder will solve the problem unless they deliberately say so. So in that case, there are tools. So there's a transcribe app by Android. And essentially, as one speaks, it'll transcribe exactly what you're saying. And I've used it with friends who are deaf, and it works really great. But there's also other apps out there where you can video chat with someone who speaks ASL or signs ASL. That way, you don't have to go through a traditional, phone call. But there's also TTY, which is a special device for people who are using the phone, but they're hard of hearing or deaf, and allows them to communicate by text instead of having to listen. And then lastly, of course, there are hearing aids and cochlear implants, which essentially sends like signals and sounds to your cochlear nerve, and that will essentially stimulate sound. It doesn't work for everyone, but people will get surgery in hopes of hearing a little bit. But I think in terms of design, it's always best to use visual cues and haptic feedback to support other ways of understanding information, which we'll get into in a bit. And then the last disability type, which is cognitive. So there are as many as 200 million people in the world who have a cognitive disability. And as I mentioned, oftentimes people with disabilities have concurrent disabilities. So of people with disabilities, about 10.8% have a cognitive disability. And as with all the conditions that I've mentioned, it's not an exhaustive list, but there are many cognitive disabilities. So of which there's Asperger's syndrome, which is characterized by difficulties with social interaction and nonverbal communication. And Asperger's is a part of the autism spectrum disorder, or autism spectrum, which refers to just a broad range of conditions characterized by challenges with social skills, repetitive behaviors, speech, and nonverbal communication. There's also Down syndrome, which is a genetic and intellectual disorder. And it's caused by birth when you have a third copy of chromosome 21. There's dementia, which is a loss of memory and language and problem solving. And one of the most common forms of dementia is Alzheimer's. There's dyslexia, which is challenges with learning and processing words and speech sounds and learning how letters and words relate to one another. I don't have this down here, but there's dyscalculia, which is similar to dyslexia, but instead it's trouble with numbers. And so it affects one's ability to do arithmetics, which is, addition, subtraction, multiplication, division. And then finally, ADD, which causes individuals to have trouble focusing. And so you might have noticed, but many cognitive disabilities affects one's speech, memory, and executive functioning. And so a few assistive technologies that help people with cognitive disabilities are AAC devices, which are augmentative alternative communication devices. And it's essentially a tablet or a laptop, or even honestly a piece of paper, where it has images associated with different texts and words, and users will be able to choose the words and feelings that they're trying to communicate in order to form a sentence despite having a speech or language disability. Also, there are some like simple tools of literally just using text with images, kind of like this AAC device, to reinforce what you're trying to communicate to an individual with a cognitive disability. There's also autocomplete and spell checkers so that one doesn't have to keep that memory and load as they're trying to type out what they're looking for. And then there's simple things like sticky notes, reminders, apps, and also specific fonts, which we'll get into. Okay, that was a lot. Are you all still with me? We're going to get into the good part now. Principles. So now that you have a general understanding of what accessibility is and who you're designing for, let's look at how to design for people with disabilities by leveraging standards and guiding principles. So as I mentioned, people with disabilities really had to fight for their place and access to environmental spaces through the ADA, but they too have advocated for digital accessibility, and therefore web standards have evolved through the use of HTML. So you may or may not have heard of the World Wide Web Consortium, which is oftentimes abbreviated as W3C, but essentially it's an organization that comprises of people from all over the world, both with disabilities and without disabilities, people who are educators, policymakers, designers, developers, and so on, to create standards and guidelines for the web. And some of these also apply to mobile, but that is definitely an area that is still being developed. But in terms of the web guidelines, there are Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which is abbreviated as WCAG. Not sure if you can hear that sound. And then there's the COGA Accessibility Guidelines, or Cognitive Accessibility Guidelines. And essentially, these accessibility standards ensure that there's equal access to the internet, and that people who are using assistive technologies or may have disabilities can interact with sites in a standardized, consistent, and reliable way. And when the World Wide Web Consortium creates standards, it oftentimes encourages companies like Google and their design systems, such as material design, to bake accessibility into their components, which ultimately scales accessibility efforts, both like within our products and just at an industry level. So I highly recommend sifting through these sites if you ever get a chance, but I'll warn you that they are super dense, despite all the things I've mentioned of keeping content clear and easy to understand. But that's why I'm here today. I'll break down some of the key guidelines that I think will be useful for you as you continue your personal brands and websites and just think about your products in the future. And so I've distilled many of these guidelines into 3 principles: perceivable, operable, and understandable. So it's important to ask yourselves, can someone with a disability perceive, operate, and understand my content? So we'll look at a few guidelines for each. That way you understand if you're meeting these bars or not. First, perceivable. So of course, information and UI components and any other content within your interface or resume or branding should be presented in a way that users can perceive it. So it's best to provide additional information other than just color or shapes, so that people with disabilities can understand the information beyond just the color or shape that you're providing. So in other words, you really want to use a combination of color, shape, text, captions, iconography, and any other multi-sensory characteristic to communicate any information that you have so that one can perceive your content. So I pulled out this text field because I feel like it's the canonical example of when you're using multi-sensory characteristics or not. So the top text field is a red outline and it has an error message in red. I took that text field and then just turned it black and white, and I can't tell it's an error message anymore. So that's a clear example of how if you're not adding another sensory characteristic, then someone who may not perceive red doesn't even know that this is an error. But also you can consider, the language as well on top of adding an icon. So making sure that it sounds like it's an error message and telling someone exactly how to fix the error, as opposed to just having a generic message that sounds like basic instructions. So as I mentioned, adding an icon will support a user in perceiving the error. But as you consider products for your case studies, it's really important to consider different component states as well, especially if you are interested in creating prototypes and want someone to actually interact and test your product. And so oftentimes there is like an activated state, there's an error state, there's a hover state, and disabled state. And you want these to differentiate between one another, especially when they're next to one another, such as in a form where you see all these text fields. So that way a user knows exactly what they're interacting with and if they need to recover any errors along the way.